You cannot be serious, Mom, Isabella Reyes gasped, her voice raw with disbelief. She juggled the phone against her ear with one hand while the other frantically rummaged through her unpacked suitcase. I literally just walked through the door after 3 years in Chicago, and you're already asking me to go scrub floors at some mob boss's estate. On the other end of the line, Rosa Reyes's voice was a fragile whisper, thin with exhaustion and thick with worry. Her pneumonia was severe, and the doctor's orders were absolute: total bed rest for at least a full week. My love, it is only for a little while, Rosa pleaded. The Castellanos have been my employers for 20 years. I cannot abandon them now, not when they are preparing for such a major event. Isabella bit her tongue, swallowing the torrent of angry words she wanted to scream. At 27 years old, she had a nursing degree and had spent 3 years escaping the shadow of a violent ex-husband. The very last thing she needed was to walk willingly back into a world controlled by dangerous men. But the image of her mother's pale, weary face in their small Brooklyn apartment was a more persuasive force than any logical argument. The old, faded scar on her shoulder began to ache with a phantom pain, a cruel reminder of what it cost her to trust the wrong kind of man. "Isn't there anyone else you can call?" she asked, a final desperate attempt, even though she knew what the answer would be. "No one understands that house the way we do, Bella, and they have faith in me. They have faith in us." Isabella glanced out the window of their humble apartment. Far away, the glittering towers of Manhattan stood like a fortress, a constant, painful symbol of the vast gulf that separated her life from the world of the Castellanos. "Fine," she conceded, the word tasting like defeat. "But I will not wear that hideous uniform you insist on. If I am going to clean their mansion, I will do it my way." "Bella, please don't make trouble," Rosa begged, her plea punctuated by a series of weak coughs. "My way, or not at all, Mom. I am not the same broken girl who fled from her life 3 years ago." The heavy silence that followed was all the confirmation she required. A small, triumphant smile touched Isabella's lips. She had won this minor skirmish, but she had no inkling that stepping into the Castellano mansion was about to detonate every plan she had ever made for her life. She could not possibly know that the stone-cold Mafia leader, a man who had never yielded to anyone, was about to be completely captivated by a woman wearing ripped jeans and carrying an attitude more lethal than any blade. If you need to find out what happens when Isabella enters that grand estate and stands before Maxwell Castellano, smash that like button and make sure you subscribe. Send this story to a friend who craves a tale of enemies becoming lovers. You will want to stay close, because this is only the start of a love story that will make your heart pound. This story is a powerful reminder that your past does not define your future. It proves that the scars we carry can become our greatest source of strength, and that love can find you in the most unexpected places, even in the home of your enemy. If you have ever been told you were not enough, this story will change the way you see yourself. The next morning, a yellow taxi pulled up to the imposing black wrought iron gates of the Castellano property. Isabella climbed out, her worn backpack slung casually over one shoulder, and then she froze, staring at the colossal structure that lay beyond the entrance. She had meticulously planned her outfit for this first encounter. Faded blue jeans with tears at the knees, a simple white t-shirt knotted at her waist to expose a narrow band of skin, and a pair of scuffed sneakers. Her long, dark hair cascaded over her shoulders, completely natural, with no hint of makeup aside from a light touch of lip balm. This was not the attire of a domestic servant, and she was keenly aware of it. Two imposing men in dark suits guarded the gate, their eyes raking over her with undisguised suspicion. "What is your business here?" one of them demanded, his tone devoid of any politeness. Isabella raised her chin, her gaze locking with his. "My name is Isabella Reyes. I am Rosa Reyes's daughter. I am here to cover my mother's shift for the week." The guard's eyebrows shot up as his gaze once again swept over her defiant clothing. "Are you certain you are at the correct address?" he sneered, his voice dripping with condescension. The help does not typically show up dressed like that. A flash of hot anger ignited in Isabella's chest, but she smothered it with a cool, composed smile. I have no idea how the help here normally dresses, but I dress for myself. So you can either call the house to verify my story, or I can get back in my cab and inform my mother that the Castellano household will be without cleaning services this week. The guard paused, clearly surprised by her sharp, unwavering response. He shot a look at his partner before grudgingly picking up a phone to make the call. After a few agonizingly long minutes, the massive iron gates began to swing inward. Isabella walked through, feeling the intense, judgmental glare of the two men on her back the entire time. A pristine white gravel path wound its way through a vast, immaculate garden, featuring perfectly manicured lawns, vibrant rose bushes, and elegant marble statues. Isabella fought to keep her expression neutral, but internally, her mind was spinning. Her mother had served here for 2 decades, yet she had never been able to truly convey this level of obscene wealth. The main house loomed ahead, a magnificent Italianate villa with towering white pillars, intricate ironwork balconies, and a formidable front door made of solid oak. Isabella ascended the marble steps and was just about to press the doorbell when the heavy door swung open. A woman who looked to be in her later years stood in the doorway, her silver hair pulled back in a severe bun. Her face was etched with stern lines around her mouth. She was dressed in a dark gray suit and held herself with the rigid posture of a soldier. "You must be Rosa's girl," she stated, her words a declaration rather than a question, as her critical eyes scanned Isabella's attire. "I am Margaret Stone, but you will call me Maggie. I am the head housekeeper for this residence." Isabella simply nodded. "Yes, I'm Isabella. My mother has spoken of you." Maggie offered no greeting in return. She just moved to the side. "Follow me. The master wishes to see you before you start your duties." Isabella crossed the threshold and felt as though she had been transported to a different dimension. The entrance hall was cavernous, with a soaring ceiling painted with breathtaking frescoes. A colossal crystal chandelier sparkled from above, scattering brilliant light over the polished black and white marble floor. The walls were lined with oil paintings in ornate, gilded frames, any one of which was probably worth more than the entire apartment building where she and her mother lived. Isabella swallowed hard, forcing herself to maintain her composure. She followed Maggie down what felt like endless corridors, the sound of her own sneakers echoing on the cold, hard stone. She occasionally glimpsed men in black suits standing sentinel in corners and doorways, and she did not fail to notice the distinct bulges of firearms concealed under their jackets. This is no ordinary rich family, Isabella thought, the memory of her mother's strict warnings surfacing in her mind. Never inquire about the Castellano family's affairs. Never look at things that are not your concern, and never, ever repeat anything you happen to overhear. Maggie finally halted in front of a heavy wooden door at the far end of a hallway. She turned, her expression impossible to decipher. "The master does not appreciate insubordination," she warned in a low voice. "You would be wise to reconsider your manner of dress and your tone of speech." Isabella responded with a faint, challenging smile. "I am here to do a job, not to be a servant." Maggie observed her for a long, silent moment before letting out a soft sigh and knocking on the door. A deep, masculine voice responded from within. "Enter." Maggie swung the door open and stepped back, unveiling an enormous study. "Mr. Castellano," she announced, "this is Isabella Reyes, Rosa's daughter." Isabella took a deep, steadying breath and walked into the room, completely oblivious to the fact that her entire existence was about to be irrevocably altered. The study was even more impressive than she could have guessed, with floor-to-ceiling oak bookshelves lining 3 of the walls. A massive walnut desk dominated the center of the space, and towering glass windows offered a panoramic view of the lavish gardens out back. But all of that opulence vanished from her mind the instant she laid eyes on the man sitting behind the desk. Maxwell Castellano was hunched over a pile of papers, a pen in one hand, his other hand propping up his forehead. A powerfully built, middle-aged man who Isabella assumed was his bodyguard stood near him, while two other men stood perfectly still, like sentinels, in the corners of the office. Maxwell did not bother to look up as she came in, his attention fixed on his work as if her arrival was of no consequence whatsoever. Isabella stood her ground in the center of the room, silent and refusing to bow her head in submission. She observed him quietly. His dark black hair was slicked back flawlessly, accentuating a face with chiseled features, a strong jaw, and a subtle scar that traced a path from his temple to the edge of his mouth. He was wearing a crisp white shirt with the sleeves rolled up to his forearms, and the open collar revealed the edge of a dark tattoo peeking from beneath the fabric. Even while just sitting and reviewing documents, he projected an intimidating aura of command that seemed to make the very air in the room feel dense and hard to breathe. This is the individual my mother has worked for these past 20 years, Isabella thought to herself. This is the man who is rumored to have taken countless lives without ever flinching. Finally, after what felt like an eternity of charged silence, Maxwell raised his head. His cold, slate-gray eyes locked with Isabella's, and he froze. The hand that held the pen paused in mid-motion. His eyes widened almost imperceptibly for a fraction of a second, before they began a slow, deliberate journey from her face, down to her shoulders, to the knotted white shirt, to her torn jeans, and all the way down to her worn-out sneakers. When his gaze finally returned to her face, Isabella saw an emotion flicker in those gray depths, something she could not quite identify. But whatever it was, it caused her heart to stumble in her chest. Maxwell slowly placed his pen on the desk and leaned back into his large leather chair, his intense gaze never once leaving her. "You are Rose's daughter," he stated, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. It was not a question, it was a declaration. Isabella offered a small, sharp nod. "Yes, I am Isabella Reyes. I will be filling in for my mother this week," Maxwell was. He remained quiet for several seconds, his unreadable gaze sweeping over her simple outfit. When he finally spoke, his voice was as cold and hard as granite. "I appreciate that you came to assist your mother, but this house operates under certain rules you are expected to follow. That begins with you wearing the staff uniform." A fire ignited in Isabella's chest, but she held her voice steady and calm. "Good morning to you too, Mr. Castellano. I regret to inform you, however, that I will not be putting on any uniform. My mother may have accepted that arrangement, but I will not." A heavy, dangerous silence descended upon the office. The powerfully built guard next to Max, a man Isabella would later know as Tony, stared at her like she had just sprouted a second head. The two men standing in the corner shot each other looks of pure disbelief. Nobody addressed Don Castellano in that tone. Nobody had the courage. A war drum began to beat in the room as Max slowly rose to his feet. Only then did Isabella truly comprehend his towering height. He moved around the massive desk, each deliberate step thudding against the hardwood floor. He came to a halt, barely a foot from her, looking down with eyes like chips of ice. "Do you have any idea who you are speaking to?" he asked, his voice a low, menacing rumble. Isabella tilted her chin up, meeting his gray stare without flinching, even as her heart hammered against her ribs. "I do," she answered with resolve. "You are Maxwell Castellano. You are my mother's employer, the man she has dedicated 20 years of her life to. But I am not my mother. I am here to do a job, not to be displayed like a piece of decor in a uniform. If that is something you cannot accept, I will leave this instant, and you can find a replacement." Max's brow furrowed, and Isabella noticed the scar on his cheek twitch almost imperceptibly. He studied her, as if attempting to see right through her. In that moment, his gaze dropped to her shoulder, where her shirt had slipped, revealing the faint edge of a very old scar. For a fraction of a second, his gray eyes went dark, but he made no comment. Instead, he turned his head to address Tony and the other two guards. "Leave us," he commanded, his tone leaving no room for discussion. All of you. I need to have a word with her in private. For a moment, Tony looked like he might protest, but he quickly snapped his mouth shut. He gave a curt nod and ushered the other men out of the room, closing the heavy door securely behind them. Suddenly, Isabella was alone with the most feared mafia boss in all of New York, and she had no idea if she had just made the smartest or the most catastrophic decision of her entire life. Once the door clicked shut, the room was consumed by a weighty silence. Max remained standing impossibly close to Isabella, his cold gray eyes locked on her face, unblinking. Isabella could smell his cologne, a rich scent of sandalwood laced with something else, something wild and dangerous she could not identify. She held her breath, waiting, bracing herself for what might come next. Then, unexpectedly, Max spun around and strode toward the large window. He stood with his hands clasped behind his back, staring out at the sprawling gardens below. "You have courage," he remarked, his voice surprisingly calmer than Isabella had anticipated. "It has been a very long time since anyone has dared to speak to me in such a manner." Isabella replied without a moment of hesitation. "That is probably because nobody dares to tell you the truth." Max turned from the window, and the corner of his mouth lifted in something that was not quite a smile, but it was no longer a threat. He moved back to his desk and poured a measure of whiskey into a heavy glass. He raised it but did not drink, instead swirling the amber liquid slowly. "We are hosting an important event in a few days," he stated, his attention fixed on the glass. "It is the launch of my family's new premium wine. Everything for this event must be absolutely perfect. Your mother is the only person who knows every detail of this house, every preference of our guests." He finally lifted his eyes to meet hers. "And now, she is in the hospital. I do not have the time to find someone new." Isabella saw it clearly. "So, you need me?" she stated, cutting through his pretense. Max set the glass down with a soft click, and his eyes sharpened again. "I do not need anyone, but I will concede that your presence right now is a necessity. There is a distinction." A small, humorless laugh escaped Isabella's lips. "You can call it whatever helps you sleep at night, but if you expect me to stay and perform the work you require, then we must renegotiate the terms." Max arched an eyebrow. "Renegotiate?" Isabella nodded firmly and took a step closer to the desk. She knew she was dancing with fire, but after surviving 3 years on the run from a monster of a husband, she had forgotten what it felt like to be afraid. "First, I will not wear a uniform," she declared, her voice ringing with clarity and strength. "Second, I will manage my work in my own way, as long as the results are up to your standards. And third," she paused, locking her gaze directly with his, "I want double my mother's salary." Max simply stared at her, his stone-like expression revealing nothing. Several long, tense seconds ticked by in complete silence. And then he laughed. It was a low, rough sound that filled the entire room. It was the first time Isabella had heard him laugh, and the sound of it sent a jolt through her. "You are negotiating with me," he said, a note of genuine amusement in his voice. "Inside my own home, over a temporary housekeeping position." Isabella did not yield. "I am presenting fair conditions for a task that you yourself have admitted is necessary. If you cannot agree to them, I am prepared to walk out of that door this very moment." Max tilted his head, observing her as if she were some fascinating unknown species. After a moment, he gave a slow, deliberate nod. "Fine," he said, the words sharp and final. "Double the pay. No uniform. You do it your way." But then he leaned forward, closing the distance between them again, his voice dropping to a low growl. "If a single thing at this event is less than perfect, you will be the one I hold personally responsible. And believe me, I am not a forgiving man." Isabella swallowed hard but held his intense gaze. "I do not require your forgiveness. I only require that you honor your word." Max studied her for another long moment before stepping back and pressing a button on his desk intercom. Maggie, he spoke into the device. Please escort Miss Reyes and brief her on her duties. She will be taking over for Rosa for the remainder of the week. He paused for a beat, his eyes flicking back to Isabella. And she will not require a uniform. Maggie's voice crackled through the speaker, laced with surprise but utterly professional. Yes, sir. As if the entire exchange was concluded, Max sat down and turned his attention to the papers on his desk. But just as Isabella was about to turn and walk away, she heard his voice, quiet but clear, behind her. You are an interesting woman, Isabella Reyes. She did not look back. She allowed herself a small, private smile and walked out of the office, her heart still racing in her chest. She had won this particular battle, but deep down, she knew the real war was only just beginning. Maggie guided Isabella through the vast mansion, her voice flat and devoid of emotion as she pointed out each section. The kitchen was the size of a five-star restaurant's, all gleaming stainless steel and commercial-grade appliances. The main living area was large enough for 100 guests, dominated by cream-colored leather furniture and a fireplace carved from marble. Banquet hall on the lower level was even more immense, with towering stone columns and a polished wood floor that shone like a dark mirror. Isabella absorbed and catalogued every detail, her mind operating like a well-oiled machine. 3 years working as a nurse had honed her ability to notice the smallest details, to organize tasks with systematic precision, and to maintain composure under any pressure. When Maggie presented her with the detailed checklist for the upcoming event, Isabella scanned it once and gave a decisive nod. I am going to need 2 additional assistants to properly clean the banquet hall, she informed Maggie. Also, the entire chandelier system needs to be wiped down again. I can see dust collecting on the upper fixtures. Maggie's eyebrows shot up in surprise at her immediate authority, but she simply nodded and made a note on her clipboard. For the rest of that day, Isabella worked relentlessly. She completely reorganized the storage for guest supplies, inspected every single crystal glass for chips or smudges, and compiled a comprehensive list of items that needed to be restocked, which she then sent to Maggie. She moved with a quick and focused energy, never uttering a complaint, never wasting a single second. At first, the other household staff watched her with wary, cautious eyes, but by the evening, they were following her lead as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Meanwhile, in his study, Max sat in front of his computer, the business reports on his desk completely forgotten. He was watching the live feeds from the security cameras, his eyes tracking Isabella's every move. He saw her in the banquet hall, confidently directing the staff as they positioned tables and chairs, her expression one of intense concentration. He watched her bend down to examine a wine glass, holding it up to the light to inspect it for streaks, before nodding in satisfaction. He saw her efficiently tie her long, dark hair back when it kept falling into her eyes. And he found himself wondering why he could not look away. She was unlike any woman he had ever encountered. She was not afraid of him, she was not submissive, and she was not trying to win his favor. She looked at him as if he were just another man, not the feared Mafia don whose name made the entire city tremble. That realization both annoyed and captivated him. Max leaned back in his leather chair, his gaze remaining on the screen while his mind drifted to the past. He thought of his brother, Jonathan, the man who was supposed to be sitting in this very chair. Jonathan was 3 years older, a natural leader, born and raised to inherit the vast Castellano empire. Max, by contrast, had only ever dreamed of becoming a doctor. He vividly recalled the sleepless nights in his medical school dorm, surrounded by heavy anatomy textbooks, his mind filled with visions of saving lives, not ending them. He had been in his final year, just a few short months from graduating. Then, he had watched Jonathan get gunned down right in front of him, caught in a brutal ambush by a rival family. Max could still feel the sensation of his brother's warm blood soaking his hands. He could still hear Jonathan's final, ragged breath. He could still see his brother's eyes, desperately trying to convey a final message he would never get to speak. On that day, Maxwell Castellano, The promising medical student with a future of healing died. In his place rose Don Castellano, a cold, ruthless man who never offered forgiveness and never forgot a debt. He had hunted down Jonathan's killers one by one, showing no mercy, and with his brother's coffin, he had buried his dream of being a doctor forever. Max blinked, forcing himself back to the present moment. On the monitor, Isabella was sharing a warm smile with an older housemaid. It was the first genuine smile he had seen from her since she had walked into his house. That simple expression softened the defiant lines of her face, making her appear younger, more approachable. Deep inside Max's chest, something he thought had been extinguished long ago flickered to life. He abruptly switched off the screen and tried to refocus on his work, determined to force the image of Isabella from his thoughts. But the faint scent of her perfume seemed to linger in his study, and he knew it was going to be a very long night. The second day at this mansion felt different, moving with a rhythm Isabella was starting to learn. She was just beginning to grasp the unspoken rules of this place. Down in the cool, quiet cellar, she was taking inventory of the wine when the crunch of tires on gravel broke the morning silence. A car had arrived. Isabella dismissed it, thinking it was just another delivery or a business associate. But later, when she returned to the grand living room to check the newly polished crystal, she froze. The scene before her felt like a violation. A woman stood there, a vision in a tight, expensive red dress. Her golden hair fell in perfect, deliberate curls. Her face was a flawless mask of makeup. Her arms were wrapped tightly around Max's neck, and her painted red lips were pressed against his cheek. Max himself was a statue, his body rigid and his hands hanging uselessly at his sides, completely still. "Darling," the woman's voice was high and syrupy sweet, "I have missed you terribly. Why have you not called me for a whole week?" Max carefully unwound her arms from his neck. His face remained a cold, unreadable mask. "Vanessa," he stated, his tone flat. "I have been busy. The event requires all of my attention." Vanessa's perfect lips formed a slight pout. "Too busy for your fiancé?" The word hit Isabella like a physical blow, a shock of icy water down her spine. Of course he had a fiancé. A man with the power and presence of Maxwell Castellano would never be unattached. She started to back away, hoping to disappear before she was noticed. But it was too late. Vanessa turned, and her piercing blue eyes locked onto Isabella. That cold gaze traveled over her, a slow and deliberate inspection from her simple ponytail down to her plain white shirt and jeans. "And who is this?" Vanessa's voice was still sweet, but now it held a sharp, cold edge that sent a chill through Isabella's entire body. Max's gaze shifted to Isabella. For just a fraction of a second, she saw a flicker of something unreadable in his gray eyes, but then it was gone. "This is Isabella Reyes," he said, his voice calm and steady. "She is Rosa's daughter. She is covering for her mother this week." Vanessa's perfectly sculpted eyebrow arched, though her eyes never left Isabella. "Oh," she said, drawing the word out. "The maid's daughter." The words were designed to sting. "I was under the impression that the staff wore uniforms. Why is she dressed like one of the guests?" A hot flash of anger shot through Isabella, but she forced it down, masking it with a polite, neutral smile. "I am not a servant, ma'am," she clarified. "I'm just helping my mother until she recovers." Vanessa moved toward her, closing the space between them. The air filled with the overwhelming scent of her expensive perfume. Her high heels gave her an advantage in height, and she used every inch of it to look down on Isabella with pure, undisguised contempt. "Whatever you are," Vanessa whispered, her voice low enough that only Isabella could hear the venom in it. "You need to remember your place here. Do not think for a second that a pretty face gives you permission to look at things that are not yours." Isabella held her gaze, refusing to back down. "I have no idea what you mean," she answered, her own voice steady and calm. "My only purpose here is to work. I am not looking at anything." Vanessa laughed, a short, brittle sound that held no warmth. Her eyes remained as cold as ice. "Good," she hissed. "Make sure you keep it that way." Then she spun back toward Max. Her sweet, adoring smile reappeared in an instant, as if their hostile exchange had never occurred. "Darling," she cooed, sliding her arm through Max's in a clear gesture of ownership. "Show me the plans for the party. My father is so excited about this." Max gave a slight nod, but not before his eyes darted back to Isabella one last time. Then he let Vanessa pull him down the long hallway. Isabella remained frozen in place, watching them go until they were out of sight. A sharp, unfamiliar ache pierced her chest, and she could not understand why. Why should it matter to her if Maxwell Castellano was engaged? She was just the maid's daughter, a temporary replacement who would be gone in a few days. She had no right to feel anything for a man like him, a powerful and dangerous figure. But as she tried to lose herself in her tasks, the image of Vanessa's possessive arm locked with his burned in her mind. Later that day, Vanessa announced she was staying for dinner. She made herself at home in the living room, sipping wine and issuing commands to the staff as if she were already the lady of the manor. Isabella did her best to stay clear of the living room, concentrating on the preparations for the big event. It was obvious, however, that Vanessa had other plans. "You!" Vanessa's sharp voice cut through the quiet. Isabella was crossing the room with an armful of clean linens. "Come here now." Isabella stopped in her tracks. She took a slow, steadying breath before turning and walking toward the couch. "Yes? Is there something you need?" she asked, her tone polite but laced with frost. Vanessa's eyes raked over her again with obvious disgust. "Get me more wine," she commanded, shoving her empty glass across the coffee table. Isabella glanced at the glass, then met Vanessa's challenging stare. "The kitchen staff can help you with that," she replied calmly. "I have to finish my work for the event." Vanessa's eyes narrowed into slits, her painted lips tightening into a hard line. "I told you to pour my wine. Are you completely deaf?" Saying nothing more, Isabella placed the linens on a nearby chair. She walked over to the wine cabinet, selected a bottle, and poured a glass of deep red wine. Her hands were steady as she set it on the table in front of Vanessa, but inside, her anger was simmering. Vanessa picked up the glass and took a delicate sip. Then, with a sudden, vicious movement, she threw the contents directly at Isabella. The cold, dark liquid drenched the front of Isabella's white shirt, instantly soaking through to her skin. Isabella was too stunned to move, staring in disbelief at the dark red stain spreading across her chest. "Oh, my apologies," Vanessa said, her voice dripping with fake sincerity. "My hand must have slipped," she smirked. "But it does not matter. You must be used to being messy. Your mother certainly is. She has spent her whole life on her knees scrubbing floors for others." Isabella's hands tightened into fists so hard her nails cut into her skin. A hot wave of fury rushed to her head, and a ringing sound filled her ears. But she stood her ground, forcing herself to stay silent for her mother's sake. For the 20 years of service her mother had given this family, her silence only seemed to fuel Vanessa's cruelty. The woman rose from the couch and closed the distance between them, her voice dropping to a venomous sneer. "I heard your mother is sick," she taunted. "It is probably from a lifetime of pathetic servitude. It must have finally broken her health. How truly pitiful." She leaned in closer. 2 decades of bowing and cleaning for other people. And what is she now? Just a useless old woman nobody cares about. At that moment, something inside Isabella broke. She could take the insults directed at her, but she would not tolerate an attack on her mother. Acting on pure instinct, her hand shot out and connected with Vanessa's cheek. The sound of the slap was sharp and loud, like a whip cracking in the silent room. Vanessa stumbled backward, her hand flying to her face, her eyes wide with utter shock and outrage. You actually hit me!" she shrieked, her voice thin and piercing. "Do you have any idea who I am?" Isabella stood tall, her body trembling with rage, her own voice like ice. "Maxwell, she struck me," Vanessa wailed. Max paid her no attention. His intense gaze remained fixed on Isabella. "Tony," he repeated, his voice even colder this time. Do what I told you. Tony nodded once and took Vanessa by the arm, gently but firmly guiding her from the room, despite her escalating protests. Once they were alone, the silence was heavy. Max finally walked toward Isabella. Follow me, he said, his tone clipped, before turning and walking down the hall. After a moment's hesitation, Isabella did as he said. He led her to his private study and shut the door behind them, sealing them inside. She braced herself for an explosion of anger. Instead, Max just looked at her, his expression impossible to read. He went to his desk, opened a drawer, and pulled out a brand new white shirt, still in its plastic wrapping. He held it out to her. Change, he said simply. The wine will irritate your skin if you leave it on. Isabella looked from the shirt to his face, completely confused. You are not going to punish me? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. Max turned away from her and stared out the window. Next time, he said, and she could hear the faintest hint of amusement in his tone. Try not to leave a handprint. It makes things difficult to explain to the Thornon family. Isabella was speechless, staring at the powerful line of his back. For the first time since setting foot in this house, a gentle warmth bloomed in her chest. Sleep would not come to her that night. Isabella lay awake in the small, plain bed in the staff wing, her mind replaying every moment of the day. She thought about the shocking force of the slap, the sting in her own palm, and Vanessa's horrified face. But mostly, she thought about Max's baffling reaction. She could not make sense of him at all. Why had he protected her? Why did he look at her that way when he gave her the shirt? When the old clock in the hall chimed 2 times, Isabella finally gave up on rest. She pulled on a light sweater and crept out of her room. The great house was submerged in darkness and silence, lit only by a few faint safety lights along the corridors. She had no destination in mind. Her feet moved on their own, guiding her through the quiet maze of the mansion until she found herself standing before the heavy wooden door to the wine cellar. After a moment of indecision, she opened it and descended the winding stone steps. The air grew cool and smelled of damp earth, aged oak, and fermenting grapes. Down in the vast cellar, rows upon rows of wine racks stretched into the shadows. Isabella moved between them, her fingertips ghosting over the cool, dusty glass of countless bottles. Each one felt like a piece of the Castellano family's history. And then she saw him. At the very back of the cellar, a figure was sitting in a worn leather armchair. It was Max. A bottle of wine sat open on a small table next to him, and he held a half-full glass in one hand. But it was the object in his other hand that made Isabella stop breathing for a second. Even in the poor light, she knew what it was. It was a medical textbook, the type she was intimately familiar with from her time in nursing school. You cannot sleep either, Max's deep voice cut through the stillness. The unexpected sound made Isabella jump. He had not even looked up from his book, yet he had known she was there. Since she had already been discovered, there was no point in leaving. She moved closer. I could say the same thing to you, she responded softly. At that, Max finally raised his head. His gray eyes found hers through the gloom. In the dim light, he looked exhausted, the sharp lines of his face seeming deeper than before. The icy control he usually wore was gone, replaced by a profound and heavy sadness. I have not slept through the night in a long time, he admitted, his voice rough. Not since Jonathan died. The name resonated with Isabella. Maggie had spoken of him. He was Max's brother, the one who was supposed to inherit the entire Castellano organization. She quietly took a seat in the empty chair opposite him, remaining silent and simply waiting for him to continue. After studying her face for a few seconds, Max held up the book. This belonged to my brother, he explained. Jonathan had a collection of these. He never wanted to be a doctor, but he said they helped him understand the human body. Where to? To inflict the most amount of pain. A short, mirthless laugh escaped his lips. But I was the one who genuinely wanted to use that same knowledge to heal people. Isabella stared at him as all the pieces clicked into place. "You were a medical student," she observed. It was not a question, but a clear statement of fact. Max gave a slow, deliberate nod. "I was in my final year of medical school. I was just a few short months away from graduating. Then Jonathan was shot and killed right in front of me, and I had no choice but to come back and take over his position." His voice was completely steady, as if he were recounting the story of a stranger, but Isabella could see the profound agony swimming in the depths of his gray eyes. She recognized that feeling intimately. It was the loss of someone you cherish, a hollowed-out space in your life that can never truly be filled. "I lost my brother too," she confided, her voice a soft whisper that still trembled after so many years. "His name was Miguel, and he was 16. He died in a terrible motorcycle accident while he was out making deliveries to help support our family. I was holding him in my arms when he drew his final breath." Max gazed at her, and, for the very first time, his expression was completely unguarded, with none of his usual defenses in place. "How old were you when that happened?" he asked her. 18, Isabella answered quietly. "He passed away the day before my birthday. I have not blown out birthday candles since that day." They sat together in a heavy silence for a considerable time. Two complete strangers, born into entirely different worlds, were suddenly connected in that moment by the shared weight of their grief. Max poured her a glass of wine from the bottle and gently slid it across the table toward her. She accepted it, taking a small sip, the taste of ripe grapes and aged oak spreading across her tongue. "Jonathan would have really liked you," Max said, his words catching her by surprise. "He was drawn to people who were not afraid of anything." Isabella looked at him from over the rim of her glass. "I am not fearless," she replied with total honesty. "The truth is, I have simply spent too much of my life being afraid, and now I no longer have the energy left for it." Max studied her with a peculiar expression on his face, as if her words had touched a long-forgotten part of his soul. They remained there until the entire bottle was empty, talking about the ones they had lost, speaking of dreams that were buried, and sharing the stories of scars that no one could see. And as the first light of dawn started to creep through the cracks of the cellar door, Isabella came to a stunning realization. She had witnessed a completely different version of Maxwell Castellano, a man who concealed his unhealed wounds behind a cold, impenetrable facade. And that thought terrified her more than anything else had before. The morning light was shining more clearly through the cellar door when Max abruptly set his glass down and looked directly at Isabella. "That scar on your shoulder," he began, his voice low but firm. "I noticed it on the very first day you arrived here. Who did that to you?" Isabella's entire body went rigid. Her hand instinctively moved to her shoulder, covering the spot where the long, thin scar was hidden beneath the fabric of her shirt. She was so accustomed to concealing it, so used to pretending it did not even exist. But Max's gray eyes held a strange kind of patience, as if he was prepared to sit there for the entire day until she gave him an answer. "That is old history," she said quietly, attempting to deflect the question. "It does not concern anyone." Max remained silent, his gaze never leaving her face. His quiet persistence felt heavier and more demanding than any spoken question ever could. Isabella felt the formidable wall she had spent 3 long years constructing around herself begin to fracture. Maybe it was because they had already shared so much vulnerability tonight, or maybe it was because she was just so profoundly tired of carrying everything alone. "My ex-husband," she finally confessed, her voice trembling slightly, no matter how hard she tried to control it. "His name is Derek Manning. We were married when I was 22, and we divorced 2 years after that." Max's brow furrowed, causing the scar on his own face to twitch. "He hit you," he stated. It was not a question, but a declaration filled with rising anger. Isabella nodded slowly, her eyes falling to the empty wineglass in her hand. "In the beginning, it was only words," she recounted evenly, her tone detached as if she were telling someone else's story. "Then it became slaps, and then it turned into beatings. This scar is from a time he shoved me into the corner of a glass table. I needed 12 stitches to close the wound. Max's hand clenched into a tight fist, his knuckles turning stark white. "Where is he now?" he demanded, his voice as cold and sharp as ice, a dangerous fury simmering just below the surface. Isabella simply shook her head. "I do not know. After the divorce was final, I ran away to Chicago and I cut off every single point of contact. For 3 years, I lived my life like a ghost. I had no social media. I spoke to no old friends. I left behind no traces at all. I was terrified he would find me." She lifted her head to look at Max, and in the depths of her dark brown eyes, he saw not a hint of weakness, but a powerful resilience that had been forged in the fires of suffering. "But I am not running anymore," she declared, her voice gaining strength with each word. "I came back to New York because my mother needs me, and I will not allow anyone, especially not Derek, to drive me away from my own life ever again." Max watched her for a long, quiet moment, his gray eyes swirling with a storm of emotions she could not begin to decipher. Then he rose to his feet and took a step closer to her. Isabella thought he was about to speak, but instead he simply extended his hand, palm facing up, in a silent invitation. "Let us go upstairs," he said gently. "The sun is up, and you need to get some rest." Isabella stared at his hand, hesitating for only a second before placing her own inside it. Max's hand was warm and strong, his fingers wrapping around hers with a gentleness that caught her off guard. He guided her up the winding stairs and through the corridors that were still cloaked in the early morning shadows, leading her all the way to her bedroom door. "Sleep," he said softly. "Do not worry about anything at all." Isabella nodded and stepped into her room. When she turned back to express her thanks, the door was already closed, and Max had disappeared down the hallway. She had no way of knowing that the very moment he left her door, Max had pulled out his phone and made a call to Tony. His voice was cold and absolutely lethal as he issued the command. "I need you to find everything on a man named Derek Manning, who is Isabella Reyes's ex-husband. I want to know where he is, what he does for a living, how he even breathes, and I want that information on my desk before the sun sets today." On the other end of the line, Tony did not ask a single question. After 20 years of service to the Castellano family, he understood when to remain silent and simply obey orders. "Yes, sir," Tony replied. "I will get on it immediately." Max ended the call and stood alone in the dark corridor, his gray eyes fixed on the wood of Isabella's door. He could not fully understand why her story had ignited such a profound rage within him. He did not know why the very thought of someone causing her harm made him want to crush that person with his own 2 hands. He only knew that Derek Manning, wherever he might be, was about to discover that he had touched something he never, ever should have. Later that afternoon, Isabella asked Maggie if she could have permission to go visit her mother for a few hours. She desperately needed to see Rosa, to hear the familiar sound of her voice, and to feel the unique sense of peace that only her mother's presence could provide. The last several days had been filled with too much turmoil. From the incident with Vanessa to the night spent in the wine cellar with Max, she felt as if her own footing was slowly becoming unstable. The small Brooklyn apartment was exactly as she remembered it, feeling cramped but filled with warmth, with family photographs adorning the walls and the comforting aroma of cooking wafting from the kitchen. Rosa was looking much better now. Her healthy color had returned to her cheeks, though she still had a lingering cough from time to time. "My daughter," Rosa said with a warm smile when she saw Isabella walk through the door. "Come and sit here with me. Tell me how things have been for you at the Castellano house." Isabella sat down next to her mother on the worn-out sofa, resting her head on Rosa's shoulder, just as she had done when she was a little girl. She talked about her work, about the big event that was coming up, and about Maggie and the other members of the staff. She made no mention of Vanessa, she did not speak about the slap, and she most certainly did not bring up the nights she had spent in the wine cellar with Max. But Rosa was her mother. She could easily perceive the truth in what was left unspoken. "Is there something else you want to tell me?" Rosa asked her gently, tenderly stroking her daughter's hair. Isabella hesitated for a moment. Then she shook her head. "It is nothing, Mom. I am just feeling tired." Rosa let out a soft sigh, her gaze becoming distant. "I know that you are hiding something from me," she said. "But that is all right. You have a right to hold on to your secrets. It is just that I believe it is finally time for me to tell you one that I have been keeping for the last 20 years. Isabella lifted her head, completely taken by surprise. "What kind of secret?" Rosa closed her eyes for a brief moment, as if she were gathering her courage. When she opened them again, Isabella could see tears beginning to form in the corners. "It is about your father," Rosa said, her voice shaking. "And it is about the real reason I have worked for the Castellano family for 2 decades. Isabella froze in place. Her father, Ricardo Reyes, was the man who had walked out on them when she was only 5 years old, leaving her mother to raise 2 children alone in poverty. She barely had any memory of him outside of a few faded photographs and the distant sound of her mother crying in the kitchen late at night. "Did you know that your father once worked for the Castellanos?" Rosa asked. Isabella shook her head, feeling completely stunned by the revelation. "I did not know that. You never said a word about it to me." Rosa nodded her head slowly. "Your father served as the personal driver for Mr. Castellano, who was Maxwell's father. He was deeply trusted, he was valued, but then he started to gamble and ended up losing a very large amount of money. He borrowed from dangerous loan sharks, and when he found himself unable to pay them back, he did something that was truly unforgivable." Isabella felt her heart begin to pound in her chest, a terrible feeling of dread rising inside her. "What exactly did he do?" she managed to ask, her voice a raw whisper. Rosa took a shaky breath, the tears continuing their silent path down her cheeks. "To cover his debts, your father took a significant amount of money from the Castellano family. It was an enormous sum. When they found out, the price for such a betrayal should have been his life. But I got on my knees, and I pleaded with Mr. Castellano to show mercy. He finally granted my request, but with a strict condition. Your father had to vanish from our lives completely, and I was to remain and work until every last cent was repaid." The confession sucked all the oxygen from the room, leaving Isabella breathless. 20 years, she murmured, the words catching in her throat. "You've spent 2 decades of your life paying for his mistake." Rosa could only nod, her weeping now unrestrained. "I never held it against your father," she explained. "My only thought was to shield you and your brother from that darkness. I never wanted you to be raised under the weight of that world. I did all of it so that you could have a chance at a normal existence, an education, a real future." Isabella pushed herself to her feet and stumbled a few steps, her hand clutching the window frame for support, the world tilting beneath her. For her entire life, she had accepted that her mother labored endlessly simply because they were poor, convinced there was no other path. She never once suspected that Rosa was shouldering a monumental debt, a burden that rightfully belonged to her father. Every one of her mother's sacrifices, each evening she returned home with hands raw and a back bent in pain, was all for the man who had walked away from them without so much as a goodbye. "Why did you never tell me?" Isabella demanded, turning to face her, her voice finally cracking under the strain. "How could you bear this all by yourself for 20 long years?" Rosa moved to her daughter and wrapped her in a tight embrace. "Because you are my child," she whispered with undeniable tenderness. "There is nothing I would not do to keep you safe." And in that moment, the dam inside Isabella finally broke. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, she wept, sobbing like a small child held in her mother's arms. She cried for Rosa's 2 decades of silent suffering, for the brother she had lost, for the ruins of her own marriage, and for that 5-year-old little girl who stood faithfully by the window, waiting for a father who was never coming home. Rosa just held her, stroking her hair just as she had done so many years ago. "Everything is going to be okay," she murmured into her hair. "We still have one another. In the end, that is all that truly matters." Isabella drove back to the Castellano estate later that evening, her eyes still puffy and crimson from weeping. She had spent the entire afternoon in the comfort of her mother's arms, and now she felt utterly empty, like a hollowed-out shell. Her only plan was to sneak up to her room unnoticed, to hide the evidence of her emotional storm. However, the moment she stepped across the threshold, a bright, youthful voice made her jump. "Oh, you have to be Isabella, am I right?" Isabella pivoted to see a young woman poised at the bottom of the grand staircase. She appeared to be around 20 years old, with rich brown hair chopped stylishly at her shoulders and eyes the exact shade of gray as Max's, but filled with a warmth his lacked. Dressed in a baggy hoodie and worn-out jeans, she looked more like a typical university student than the sibling of a powerful syndicate leader. "My name is Sophia," the girl announced, approaching with a disarming smile. "I am Maxwell's sister. He mentions you quite often." Isabella was taken aback by the statement. "He talks about me?" Sophia let out a light laugh. "Yes, well, in his own way. He isn't a man of many words, but I've become an expert at reading between his silences. He told me there was a new person working in the house, someone headstrong who wasn't intimidated by anyone. I knew immediately he was talking about someone quite special." Isabella was at a loss for how to respond. She had never encountered anyone from the Castellano family with such an open and friendly demeanor. Sophia was the complete opposite of Max's icy reserve and the formal distance maintained by everyone else who lived there. "Are you all right?" Sophia's tone shifted, suddenly laced with genuine concern. "Your eyes look really red." Isabella's first instinct was to invent a lie, but she found she couldn't, so she simply shook her head. "Today was just a little difficult," she conceded quietly. Sophia gave a nod of deep understanding and, without warning, she reached out and took Isabella's hand. "You should come with me," she insisted, gently pulling her in the direction of the kitchen. "There is almost nothing that a good cup of hot chocolate cannot fix." They ended up sitting in the warm kitchen for close to an hour, sipping the rich chocolate and talking about absolutely everything. Sophia shared her story about studying law and her passionate dream of becoming an attorney who defends the rights of children. She spoke of how much she detested living under the shadow of the Castellano family name, yet still adored her brother with an unwavering loyalty. As Isabella listened, she felt the heavy weight on her spirit begin to lift. There was an earnest quality to Sophia that made her feel secure, as if she had discovered an unexpected ally in this dangerous and alien environment. "Max has changed significantly since you arrived," Sophia commented abruptly. "I visit home frequently, and I have never seen him behave this way. He seems gentler somehow, and much less guarded. I am not sure what you did, but I want to thank you." Isabella was just opening her mouth to object when Maggie walked into the kitchen. The older woman stopped short when she saw them together, and an exceptionally rare smile touched her stern lips. "Sophia is correct," Maggie affirmed, her voice unusually soft. "I have been here for 20 years, ever since Max was just a boy. I was here when he transformed into the cold man he is today, right after Jonathan's death. But over these last few days, I have noticed a shift in him, and I am certain that this change is because of—" Isabella's heart began to beat a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She was speechless, completely unsure of what to think or feel. Sophia gave her hand a reassuring squeeze and offered a knowing smile. "You are going to stay, are you not? After this wine launch is over, you will stay here with us." Isabella's mind raced, thinking of her mother and the 2-decade-long debt. She thought of the painful history that she had only just unearthed. She thought of Derek and the oppressive fear that had stalked her for 3 long years. Then, she thought of Max, of his gray eyes that were so cold on the surface, but seemed to conceal a pain that mirrored her own. She had been on the run for far too long, fleeing from Derek, from her past, from herself. Maybe this was the time to finally stop running and confront it all. "I will stay," Isabella heard herself say, her voice stronger than it had been in years, "at least until everything is settled." Sophia let out a cheer and pulled her into a tight hug. Maggie merely offered a slow nod, but deep in the housekeeper's eyes, Isabella glimpsed a spark of hope that she had not seen in a very long time. The day of the grand wine launch finally dawned. The Castellano estate had been completely remade into a breathtaking vision of sophistication and elegance. It was illuminated by the soft glow of thousands of flickering candles, and stunning arrangements of white roses were placed everywhere. A live orchestra filled the grand banquet hall with the gentle strains of classical music. Since the early morning, Isabella had been immersed in her work, conducting final checks on every detail. She meticulously inspected everything from the precise arrangement of the tables and chairs to the exact placement of the priceless bottles of rare wine. She was determined to make sure that not a single thing was out of place, not just for the sake of her job, but to prove to herself that she was capable of this. Later that afternoon, while Isabella was reviewing the guest manifest one last time, Sophia suddenly materialized and tugged her towards one of the rooms. "You cannot possibly wear jeans to the party tonight," Sophia declared with excitement. "Max has officially invited you to attend as his guest." Isabella froze in place. "What? I am just a temporary employee here. I cannot do that." Sophia simply waved a dismissive hand. "He has already made up his mind. And when Maxwell Castellano makes a decision, nobody can change it. Besides, I have already found the perfect dress for you to wear." Before Isabella had a chance to argue further, Sophia presented a long black gown she had pulled from the wardrobe. The dress was a masterpiece of simple elegance, featuring a graceful bateau neckline and long sleeves made of delicate sheer lace. It was fitted through the torso and then flared out gently toward the floor. "I bought this for a university formal, but I never had a chance to wear it," Sophia clarified. "We are about the same size, so I am sure it will fit you perfectly." Isabella's gaze moved from the beautiful dress to Sophia's smiling face, a wave of emotion making her throat feel tight. She was not accustomed to this kind of genuine care. She was not used to people offering her kindness with no expectation of getting something in return. "Thank you, Sophia," she whispered, her voice thick. Sophia just beamed and gently nudged her in the direction of the bathroom. "Go on and get ready. We only have 2 hours until the party starts." 2 hours later, Isabella stood in front of a full-length mirror and could hardly believe it was her own reflection. The black gown fit as if it were made for her, beautifully accentuating her warm skin tone and graceful curves. Sophia had skillfully applied some light makeup for her, consisting of just a little mascara, a hint of blush, and a soft, nude lipstick. She had swept Isabella's long, dark hair into an elegant updo, which revealed the graceful line of her neck and the simple pearl earrings Sophia had insisted she borrow. "You look absolutely stunning," Sophia pronounced with a tone of deep satisfaction. "Max is not going to be able to look away." Isabella could feel a blush creeping up her cheeks, but she remained silent, instead taking a single, steadying breath before she walked out of the room. The main staircase was already teeming with people when Isabella appeared at the landing above. She glanced down into the sprawling hall below, where hundreds of impeccably dressed guests were conversing and enjoying glasses of wine. She could identify a few prominent faces from news reports, including powerful business tycoons and politicians, as well as others who she could only assume were part of the city's hidden underworld. This is Maxwell's world, she realized with a jolt, a dazzling and treacherous place where she had never felt she belonged. As Isabella started her descent down the stairs, Max happened to look up. In that precise instant, his piercing gray eyes located her among the throng of people, and he went completely still. She watched as the wine glass in his hand paused midway to his lips, and she saw his mouth part slightly as if to say something, but no sound escaped. He commanded the room in a black three-piece suit, his presence like that of a king surveying his court. But in the instant their gazes connected, Isabella saw past the formidable Mafia boss. Instead, she recognized the man who had shared a glass of wine with her in the quiet cellar, the one who listened to her story and offered no judgment. Max set down his glass and walked to the foot of the staircase, extending his hand with the grace of a true gentleman. "You look beautiful," he said, his voice a low rumble, deeper and more textured than usual. Isabella placed her hand into his, feeling an immediate warmth travel up her arm from his touch. "Thank you for inviting me," she replied, her voice steady, even as her heart pounded against her ribs. Max remained silent, simply guiding her into the bustling heart of the great hall. Every single eye in the room followed them, and whispers erupted in their wake. But Isabella paid them no mind. Her entire focus was on the secure feeling of Max's hand holding hers, a gesture that felt like a clear declaration to the entire world that she belonged right there with him. From a shadowed corner of the room, Vanessa Thornton watched them, her cold blue eyes burning with a searing hatred from within her crimson gown. The party began smoothly, with the first few hours passing in a blur of social pleasantries. Guests moved through the hall, their laughter mixing with the clinking of glasses as they sampled delicate appetizers and savored the finest wines from the Castellano family's renowned collection. Isabella remained close to Max's side for most of the evening, as he introduced her to his most trusted business partners, simply as a friend of the family. She felt the weight of many curious, even astonished stares, but nobody was bold enough to directly question who she was. The influence of Maxwell Castellano was far too great for anyone to dare challenge his personal choices. Vanessa was also there, attached to the arm of her father, George Thornton, one of the Castellano family's oldest allies. She continuously shot venomous glances toward Isabella, but Isabella refused to let it affect her. She was already accustomed to Vanessa's hostility and had no desire to let that predictable bitterness spoil her night. Midway through the event, Max made his way to the small, elevated stage at the front of the hall. As he stepped up, the ambient lights dimmed low. A single spotlight illuminated him, and an expectant hush fell over the entire room. "Ladies and gentlemen," Max started, his powerful voice filling the vast space with ease. "Tonight, it is my honor to introduce to you the newest pride of the Castellano family, the Rosadoro wine line, which has been crafted from the most exceptional grapes from our ancestral vineyard in Tuscany. But before we all raise our glasses to Rosadoro, I want to offer you something even more extraordinary. This is a bottle that has rested in our family's cellar for 100 years, waiting for an occasion special enough to be opened." Max gave a slight nod, and Tony appeared on stage, carefully carrying an ancient, dust-covered bottle protected within a glass case. A wave of appreciative murmurs swept through the hall. Everyone there understood the immense value of a century-old vintage, not just in terms of money, but in its historical significance. With great care, Max opened the bottle and poured a small measure into a crystal glass to inspect its color before he would taste it. Isabella watched him from the floor as he held the glass up to the spotlight, swirling the dark liquid gently. In that moment, she saw his entire demeanor shift. A deep frown creased Max's brow as he brought the glass to his nose. After a small, cautious sip, his gray eyes turned dark and his jaw clenched with tension. Something was terribly wrong. Isabella felt a knot of anxiety tighten in her stomach as Max put the glass down, his expression now as cold and hard as granite. "The wine is ruined," he said to Tony, his voice low and sharp, yet Isabella could still hear it from her position near the stage. While Max's jaw remained tight, a flicker of calculated frost passed through his eyes. He had watched Vanessa on the security monitor hours earlier and had deliberately allowed this sabotage to occur. In truth, the authentic century-old vintage had been secured in his private safe long before the party. The bottle on stage was merely a decoy, Max had orchestrated this entire scene to lure Vanessa into a carefully constructed trap. He had permitted her to destroy a worthless bottle, all to create a public spectacle where he could finally tear away the Thorntons' respectable mask. It was his way of proving to the world that Isabella was under his absolute and unwavering protection. Someone has sabotaged it. Before the unease could escalate, a sharp, accusing voice cut through the crowd. I know who is responsible. Vanessa Thornton strode forward, a look of pure triumph on her face. I saw her, she declared, pointing a trembling finger directly at Isabella. The maid's daughter. She was sneaking into the cellar late last night. She must have done something to the bottle. Every head in the hall swiveled to face Isabella. She felt the hot blood rush to her cheeks, a roaring sound filling her ears from the shock and the sudden surge of rage. She had done nothing of the sort. Yes, she had been in the cellar with Max, but she had not touched a single bottle. That is a complete lie, Isabella said, her voice holding firm even as her world began to spin out of control. I did not do it. Vanessa offered a cold, cruel smile. Oh, is that so? Then perhaps you can explain why you were down in the cellar at 2 o'clock in the morning? She pivoted to face the audience, her voice rising with dramatic flair. Everyone here is aware of who she really is. She is the maid's daughter, whose own father stole from the Castellano family before he vanished. It seems that betrayal is something that runs in their blood. Isabella felt the words like a physical blow across her face. Vanessa knew about her father. How she knew was a mystery, but it was irrelevant now. The shameful secret was exposed in front of hundreds of people, and it was a truth she could not deny. Some of the guests began to whisper amongst themselves, their gazes turning suspicious and contemptuous. In an instant, she was utterly alone in a sea of strangers, the crushing weight of loneliness and helplessness tightening around her throat. She wanted to scream out that she was innocent, that Vanessa was fabricating everything, but she knew with sickening certainty that no one would ever believe a person like her. Vanessa pressed her advantage, her voice swelling with victory. She is jealous of my position. She wants to ruin the Castellano family as revenge for her father. She should be thrown out of here this instant, or better yet, punished in the way the Castellanos handle traitors. Isabella's eyes shot to Max, who remained perfectly still on the stage, wrapped in silence. His face was an unreadable mask, showing no trace of emotion. His cool gray eyes simply scanned the scene below him, as if he were dispassionately analyzing every single detail of a business transaction. She had no idea what he was thinking. She could not know if he actually believed Vanessa's poisonous words. All she knew for certain was that if he did, her life would be over tonight. In that terrifying moment, Isabella understood that she was completely and utterly on her own. Max's silence stretched on, feeling like an entire century. Isabella stood frozen, feeling the crushing weight of hundreds of judging eyes from every corner of the magnificent ballroom. She had the desperate urge to run, to vanish from this place entirely, but her feet felt as though they were nailed to the polished marble floor. Just a few steps away, Vanessa watched her, a triumphant smirk spreading across her crimson lips. Behind her, George Thornton maintained a stern expression, his posture showing clear support for his daughter's public accusation. Isabella felt the walls of the grand room closing in on her, with no possible escape in sight. Then, Max finally spoke, and it seemed as if the entire room held its breath. Miss Thornton, he began, his voice dangerously low and even, as if he were merely commenting on the weather instead of addressing a grave act of sabotage. Are you saying that you witnessed Miss Reyes sneaking into the cellar last night? Vanessa nodded with enthusiasm, her blue eyes gleaming with excitement, utterly convinced that Max was about to side with her. Yes, I saw her with my own eyes. She went down into the cellar at around 2 in the morning. Who can say what she did to your family's priceless wine? Max gave a slow, deliberate nod, then gestured toward Tony. Tony came forward immediately, holding a digital tablet. He passed it to Max, who then turned the bright screen to face the crowd. This estate is equipped with the most advanced security camera system available, Max stated calmly, though a menacing undercurrent laced every word he spoke. Every single corner of this house is recorded 24 hours a day, and that includes the wine cellar. Vanessa's confident expression began to falter. Isabella watched as the victorious smile vanished from her face, replaced by a flicker of sudden confusion and dawning fear. This is the footage from the cellar last night, Max continued, and then he pressed play. The screen displayed the black and white video feed from the cellar. Isabella saw her own image appear as she walked down the stone steps, pausing when she saw Max sitting at the far end of the room. She watched the recording of them talking and sharing wine before leaving the cellar together. At no point in the footage did she ever go near or touch any of the bottles on the racks, other than the one Max had already opened for them. But this is the most interesting part, Max announced, and he fast-forwarded the video. The timestamp jumped ahead to 4 in the morning in the now empty cellar. Then, a new figure appeared at the top of the stairs. It was Vanessa Thornton. A wave of gasps and murmurs spread throughout the room. On the screen, Vanessa crept down into the cellar, her eyes darting around to make certain no one was there. She then moved directly to the wine rack. She retrieved the century-old bottle, uncorked it, and carefully poured the contents of a small vial into it. After she had sealed it back up, she returned it to its original spot and slipped away as silently as she had arrived. "No!" Vanessa shrieked, her face turning as white as paper. "That is a fake. That video has been doctored. You edited it just to protect that little tramp." Max set the tablet down on a nearby table and stepped off the stage, each footstep echoing in the dead silence that had fallen. He moved through the crowd of stunned guests like a force of nature, and people instinctively parted to clear a path for him. He came to a halt directly in front of Vanessa, staring down at her with eyes that were as cold as shards of ice. "You just publicly slandered an innocent woman in front of all of my guests," he said, his voice a low, threatening growl. "You destroyed a bottle that was a 100-year-old legacy of my family, and now you dare to invoke my name while you beg for mercy?" Vanessa began to tremble violently, her legs threatening to buckle beneath her. Her father, George, stepped forward, his own face now drained of all its color. "Maxwell," he pleaded, "please be calm. We can resolve this matter in private." Vanessa is still young. She did not fully understand the consequences of her actions. Max turned his unyielding gaze on George Thornton. "Mr. Thornton, I have always respected the years of cooperation between our families, but I do not forgive betrayal, and it does not matter who the traitor is. Take your daughter and get her out of my house immediately. We will discuss the consequences of this later." At his signal, Tony and two other large men moved forward and took Vanessa firmly but gently by her arms. She began to struggle against them, screaming a torrent of curses. "She will pay for this!" Vanessa shrieked, her eyes now bloodshot with rage locked on Isabella. "She is nothing but a maid's daughter. She does not deserve to be standing next to you." Max did not even grant Vanessa a final glance. Instead, he moved to stand directly in front of Isabella, positioning himself like a fortress to shield her from every critical gaze in the room. He held out his hand, and Isabella, feeling as if she were in a trance, placed her own hand in his. There, before hundreds of guests, in front of the most powerful and feared figures in New York, Maxwell Castellano raised Isabella's hand to his lips and pressed a soft, deliberate kiss to her knuckles. "Anyone who slanders her, slanders me," he declared, his voice ringing with absolute authority through the now silent hall. "And everyone in this room knows what happens next. The painful price of defying me." Tears welled up in Isabella's eyes, but she fought them back with sheer will. She met Max's gaze, looking into those gray eyes that now held an emotion she was afraid to give a name to. She had no idea what her future was going to look like. She could not know where this one decision would ultimately take her. The only thing she knew for certain was that in that very moment, standing in a world filled with danger and deception, she was finally not on her own anymore. The celebration continued much later than anyone had anticipated. And yet, Not a single person brought up the shocking incident with the 100-year-old bottle or the embarrassing scandal involving Vanessa Thornton. The launch of the Rosadoro wine was, by all accounts, a spectacular success. Important contracts were signed, and the powerful reputation of the Castellano family was left completely intact. When the very last of the guests had finally driven away, Isabella found herself standing alone on the mansion's rooftop. She stared out at the magnificent Manhattan skyline, a glittering tapestry of countless lights. She desperately needed the cool night air, needed some quiet space to process the whirlwind of events that had taken place that night. She heard the sound of footsteps approaching from behind her, and somehow she knew exactly who it was, without even turning around. Max was standing right beside her, and for a long, quiet moment, they both looked out over the sprawling city lights in silence. The night wind carried the distinct chill of autumn, causing Isabella to shiver. Without saying a single word, Max took off his expensive suit jacket and gently draped it over her shoulders. Isabella felt the urge to refuse the gesture, but the warmth it provided was too comforting to deny, and so she accepted it. "I owe you an apology," Max said suddenly, his voice low and heavy with weariness. "I should have stepped in much sooner than I did. I never should have allowed Vanessa to take things that far." Isabella turned to face him, her expression filled with surprise. She had fully expected him to talk about the ruined wine, or the massive business loss, or almost anything else besides offering an apology. "You do not need to apologize to me," she said. "You already protected me in front of everyone. To be honest, I did not think you would do that." Max looked directly at her, his gray eyes seeming incredibly deep in the dim light of the balcony. "You actually thought I would just stand by and let them hurt you." Isabella paused for a moment. "I did not know what to think. I am just very used to protecting myself. I am not used to having someone else stand in front of me." Just like that. Max became quiet, his gaze returning to the distant skyline, his jaw clenched, a clear sign of an internal battle. "I am not a good person, Isabella," he confessed, his voice rough with emotion. "I have committed monstrous acts. I have taken lives, inflicted torture, and shattered countless families." He held up his hands, looking at them with utter revulsion. "These hands are stained with more blood than I could ever wash away. You should stay far away from someone like me." Isabella watched him closely, seeing the profound pain and regret that filled his eyes. She thought about her mother, who had lived for 20 years in the shadow of this very family. She remembered her own father, who had betrayed them and disappeared, and she felt the sting of her own scars, both visible and hidden. "I already know who you are," she told him softly, "and I understand the dangers that surround your world. But what you did in your past is not the issue. The real question is who you decide to be from this day forward." Max looked at her, completely taken aback. "You do not fear me. You are not disgusted by the things I have done." Isabella moved a step nearer, close enough to feel the warmth of his breath against her cheek. "I have spent too much of my life being afraid," she explained. "I was terrified of my former husband, terrified of what happened before, and terrified of what was to come. But when I am with you," she paused, trying to find the right expression, "I do not feel that fear. Instead, I feel protected, and that sensation unnerves me more than anything else." Max slowly raised a hand, his fingertips tracing her cheek with a touch so gentle it was almost imperceptible. "I am not worthy of you," he whispered. Isabella covered his hand with her own, holding it firmly against her skin. "Every one of us has a history," she said. "I am not in a position to pass judgment on yours. What I see is a man who is desperately trying to change, a man fighting against his own inner demons. To me, that struggle is worth far more than some illusion of perfection." Max gazed at her for a long, silent moment, his eyes filled with emotions she had never witnessed in him before. Then, he lowered his head, moving so slowly that she had every chance to turn away if she wanted to. But Isabella did not move. Instead, she tilted her face up to his. Their initial kiss was tender and hesitant, like two strangers navigating a dark and unfamiliar path. Then Max gathered her into his arms, clinging to her as if terrified she might simply disappear. The kiss grew deeper, filled with a fierce and desperate passion. Isabella wrapped her arms around his neck, absorbing his warmth and feeling the heavy beat of his heart against her chest. In that single instant, the rest of the world ceased to exist. There was no agonizing past and no frightening future, only two individuals on a rooftop beneath the New York sky, holding on to one another as if their lives depended on it. When they finally separated, Max pressed his forehead to hers, his warm breath ghosting across her lips. "I promise you, no one will ever cause you harm again," he swore. "Whatever it takes." Isabella offered him a smile, the first genuine smile she had shown in a very, very long time. "And I am done running," she answered, "no matter how perilous this world becomes." They remained in that embrace as the first hints of dawn painted the Manhattan horizon in shades of pink. Two shattered hearts that had finally discovered a place where they could begin to mend. The days following the party passed in a haze for Isabella. She and Max kept their connection private, not announcing it to anyone. Still, everyone who lived in the mansion saw the subtle signs on full display. They noticed the secret looks they shared, the brief touches of their hands as they passed in the halls, and the long nights they spent talking on the roof until sunrise. Sophia would light up with joy any time she saw them near each other, while Maggie would just offer a quiet smile and act as if she saw nothing at all. Isabella started to think that maybe, just maybe, she had discovered real happiness, that fortune was finally on her side. But the past is never willing to let go of its prisoners so easily. Later that afternoon, as Isabella helped Maggie inspect the furniture in the grand sitting room, Tony came in looking incredibly tense. "Miss Reyes," he said formally, "there is someone at the front gate asking for you." Isabella looked up, confused. Who could it be? Tony paused for a heartbeat. "He claims to be your former husband, Derek Manning." The words hit Isabella with the force of a physical blow. The color drained completely from her face, and her legs felt like they would give out from under her. Derek. That name was a vile curse, a phantom from a past she had worked so hard to bury. How could he have possibly found her? How did he know she was at this place? "Do not allow him inside," Isabella said, her voice trembling uncontrollably. "I refuse to see him." Tony glanced over at Max, awaiting the order to remove the unwanted guest. Max's face, however, was a mask of unreadable calm. "Let him enter, Tony," Max commanded, his tone possessing a chilling and lethal stillness. If he was foolish enough to walk directly into the lion's den, then I want to witness the expression he makes when he understands there is no way out. A short while later, flanked by two armed security guards, Derek Manning walked into the room. A smirk played on his lips, but it never reached his cold, empty eyes. Isabella spun around and saw Derek standing right there, inside the Castellano mansion's formal sitting room. He looked exactly as she remembered him, tall with blonde hair and blue eyes, the same handsome features that had once charmed her. But looking at him now, she could only see the profound cruelty that lurked behind that appealing smile. She saw the monster who had utterly destroyed 3 years of her existence. "What are you doing here?" Isabella demanded, her voice an icy whisper that betrayed the wild panic racing through her. Derek simply shrugged as he took a step forward. "I have my sources. I heard a rumor you were working for the Castellanos now. Or maybe, sleeping your way to the top is more accurate." Tony moved to intercept him, but Derek held up his hands in a gesture of fake innocence. "Take it easy," he said with a sneer. "I only came here to speak with my ex-wife." A wave of sickness washed over Isabella. "We have absolutely nothing to discuss. Get out." Derek just shook his head, his smile twisting into something far more menacing. "Oh, I believe we do. For instance, have you mentioned our child to your new boyfriend? Have you told him how you got rid of it?" Isabella felt the world stop. Tears immediately welled in her eyes. "No," she whispered, pleading. "Please do not." Derek stepped even closer, raising his voice so that every person in the room could hear him. "She was carrying my child," he announced loudly. "And she decided to have an abortion because she did not want to have my baby. She is a murderer." "That is a lie," Isabella sobbed, tears now streaming down her face. "I had a miscarriage because you beat me. You kicked me in the stomach when I was 3 months pregnant. You are the one who killed our baby, not me." A heavy silence descended upon the room. Tony stood frozen in place, his hands clenched into tight fists. Maggie brought a hand to her mouth, her face a mask of pale shock. It was at that exact moment that Max walked in. Isabella had no idea how much of the conversation he had overheard, but a single glance at his expression confirmed her worst fears. He had heard everything. Max's face was like a sheet of ice, but his gray eyes blazed with a terrifying fury she had never seen before. He walked straight past Tony, straight past Isabella, and came to a halt directly in front of Derek. "What did you just say?" Max asked, his voice dangerously low. Derek seemed to shrink back for a second under the Mafia boss's intense gaze, but quickly regained his composure. "She is not telling the truth. She chose to end the pregnancy, and now she is trying to put the blame on me." Max did not respond. He just stared at Derek for another moment, then shifted his attention to Tony. "Tony," he said, his voice disturbingly calm, "please escort Isabella out of the room. I need to have a private conversation with Mr. Manning." Isabella wanted to argue, to stay and prevent Max from doing something he might regret. But Tony gently gripped her arm and guided her out. The heavy door clicked shut behind them, leaving her to tremble and cry in the hallway. DS8. Roughly 15 minutes later, the door swung open, and Max stepped out. His hands were clean, but Isabella could see the fresh bruises across his knuckles. Behind him, 2 of his men were dragging Derek away. The man's face was a swollen and bloody mess, but he was still breathing. "He will never bother you again," Max stated, his voice still carrying a cold edge, though his eyes were soft as they looked at Isabella. "I presented him with 2 options. He could either leave this country and never return, or he could vanish in a more permanent way. He chose the first option." Isabella stared at him, her vision blurred by tears. "You did not kill him." Max shook his head as he gently wiped the tears from her cheeks. "You asked me not to, that night we were in the cellar," he said, reminding her of her plea. "I honored my promise to you. But if he is ever foolish enough to come back, I will not offer him the same mercy a second time." Isabella threw herself into his arms, sobbing uncontrollably into the fabric of his shirt. Max held her securely, pressing his lips to the top of her head. The specter from her past had finally been banished, and for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, Isabella felt completely and truly safe. Around 15 minutes went by before the door finally swung open and Max stepped out. His hands were clean, showing no trace of blood, yet Isabella noticed the fresh raw bruises across his knuckles. Following him, 2 men were dragging Derek from the room. Derek's face was a swollen, bloody mess, but he was breathing. He was alive. "You will never have to see him again," Max stated. His voice remained icy, but his eyes softened as they met Isabella's. "I presented him with 2 options. He could either leave this country and never return, or he could vanish in a more permanent way. He chose the first path." Isabella stared at him, her vision blurred by tears. "You did not take his life." Max slowly shook his head and gently wiped a tear from her cheek. "You asked me not to, that night in the cellar," he said, reminding her softly. "I honored my promise. But if he is ever foolish enough to come back, I will not offer mercy a second time." Isabella collapsed into him, her arms wrapping tightly around his waist as she sobbed into his chest. Max held her securely, his lips pressing against the top of her head. The specter that had haunted her for so long was finally gone, and for the very first time in years, Isabella felt completely and truly free. One week following the confrontation with Derek, Isabella's life began to find its rhythm again, or at least what passed for normal within the walls of the Castellano mansion. She continued to live there, no longer as a housekeeper on a temporary basis, but as an honored guest of Max. She still insisted on helping Maggie with chores around the house, explaining that she was not accustomed to being idle. Rosa had made a full recovery and was back at work, but Max had lightened her workload considerably and given her a substantial raise in pay. It seemed as if all the pieces were finally settling into a peaceful arrangement, until one afternoon when Tony walked into the sitting room with a very serious look on his face. "Sir," Tony addressed Max, "there is a gentleman at the gate who is asking to see Mrs. Rosa and Miss Isabella. He says that his name is Ricardo Reyes." Isabella, who had been sitting and reading a book next to Max, went completely still. She heard the distinct sound of glass shattering on the floor and saw that it was Rosa, who had been standing in the doorway with a tray of tea. Her mother's face was as white as a sheet of paper. "Ricardo," Rosa breathed, her voice shaking violently. "He is alive. He actually came back." Max stood up and placed a reassuring hand on Isabella's shoulder. "Do you want to see this man?" he asked her, his tone gentle. Isabella was not sure how to respond. Her father, the person who had walked out on his family 22 years ago, the one who had left her mother buried under a mountain of debt, the man she had despised for her entire life, was now right outside the gate requesting to see them. She looked over at her mother and saw an emotion she did not expect to find in Rosa's eyes. It was not hatred. It was a glimmer of hope. "Allow him to come in," Isabella finally managed to say, her voice thick with emotion. "But if he brings my mother any more pain, I will be the one to throw him out." Tony gave a single nod and departed. A few minutes later, a man was shown into the sitting room. Ricardo Reyes appeared much older than he did in the photographs Isabella possessed. His once black hair was now completely white. His face was a map of deep lines and age spots, and his frame was stooped and thin, as if the burdens of his life had physically crushed him. And yet, his dark brown eyes had not changed. They were the same eyes Isabella had inherited, and they were now fixed on his wife and daughter, filled with an indescribable amount of pain. "Rosa," he managed to say, his voice thick with emotion. "My daughter." Rosa just stood there, motionless, as silent tears streamed down her face. Isabella reached out and squeezed her hand, feeling the tremors that shook her mother's entire body. "Why have you come here?" Isabella demanded, her tone cold as ice. "After 22 years of absolute silence, you believe you have any right to stand before us?" Ricardo's head drooped, his shoulders trembling with unspoken grief. "I know I do not deserve to be here," he admitted. "I walked away from my family and left both of you to carry the weight of my terrible mistakes. I was a coward. I was a failure." He lifted his head, his face wet with tears. "Not a single day has gone by when I did not think of you. There has not been one night where I did not dream of Isabella, when she was just a little girl. I wanted so desperately to come back, but I was terrified. I was afraid you would reject me, afraid to confront the man I had become. For the last month, I have spent every single night hidden in the shadows across the street from your apartment in Brooklyn, just watching the lights in your window and crying alone, too ashamed to show my face until I was sure I could genuinely ask for your forgiveness. Then I got the news that Miguel had died. I was not there for my son when he needed me the most. In that moment, I knew my time running away had to end." Isabella felt her deep-seated anger warring with another emotion, something she was reluctant to acknowledge. Looking at him now, she did not see a heartless monster who had abandoned them. Instead, she saw a broken man, utterly crushed by the weight of his own sins. "What is it that you want from us?" she asked, her voice a little softer this time. Ricardo immediately dropped to his knees on the hard floor. "I am begging you for forgiveness. I know I am not worthy of it, but I am pleading for a chance to atone, a chance to somehow make up for all the years I have lost." Rosa took a step forward and knelt down next to him, gently taking his trembling hands into her own. "I have waited for so long, Ricardo," she said, her words choked by tears. "I was so angry with you, but I never, ever stopped loving you." Isabella watched her parents kneeling on the floor together, and she felt her own tears begin to surface. She was so tired of all the hatred. She knelt down beside them. "I cannot forgive you yet," she said, her voice firm and clear. "But I am willing to give you a chance to earn it. Do not disappoint my mother again." Ricardo looked up at her, his face a mask of tearful gratitude. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice cracking. Max observed the scene quietly from the corner of the room, his thoughts turning to his own father. He was realizing that no family is ever perfect. But with enough love and a willingness to forgive, even the deepest wounds have a chance to heal. 3 months had passed since the day Ricardo Reyes came back into their lives, and everything had changed in ways Isabella had never allowed herself to imagine. Rosa was no longer a housekeeper. Max had promoted her to a new position, managing all of the Castellano family's legitimate properties. It was a role of great prestige, with a salary that properly reflected her 20 years of unwavering loyalty. Ricardo was proving his commitment with actions, not just words. He secured a job as a carpenter at a local workshop near Brooklyn and returned home on time each evening. He helped his wife prepare their meals and listened intently to all the stories he had missed over the past 22 years. Isabella began working for a non-profit organization that provided support to women who had survived domestic violence. There, she could transform her own painful history into a source of strength to help others just like her. She continued to live in the Castellano mansion, but now she was there as Max's official partner. It was a relationship that neither of them felt the need to conceal any longer. That evening, Max had invited everyone to dinner at Rosa and Ricardo's small apartment in Brooklyn. Isabella found this surprising, as Max almost always preferred to host gatherings at the mansion. He simply offered a mysterious smile and said he wanted to have a genuine family dinner. The little apartment felt incredibly warm, filled with the delicious aroma of Rosa's cooking, the sound of easy laughter, and a sense of happiness that was entirely new to Isabella. Rosa and Ricardo sat close to each other, occasionally sharing tender looks like a pair of newlyweds. Sophia had flown home from her university just to be there. She sat next to Isabella, talking excitedly about her law studies. Maggie was also present, now smiling freely as she recounted stories from Max's childhood that made him turn red. Tony stood in his customary corner, but even he wore a faint, rare smile. In the middle of the meal, Max stood up and gently tapped his glass with a fork to capture everyone's attention. "I have something to announce," he said, and his voice held a warmth Isabella had never heard from him before. "I have made the decision to return to medical school and complete the degree I abandoned 5 years ago." A hush fell over the table for a brief moment. Then, Sophia let out a cheer and threw her arms around her brother in a tight hug. Rosa quietly wiped away tears of joy, and Maggie gave a nod of deep satisfaction, as if she had been waiting for this day for many years. Isabella looked at Max, and her heart swelled with an immense sense of pride. He was finally chasing his own dream, the one he had been forced to bury along with his brother. "I will, of course, continue to run the Castellano Empire," Max added. "But I have reorganized the entire structure to create time for my studies." And more importantly, his gaze shifted and settled on Isabella. "I am trying to build a future that I can actually be proud of, a future that I can share with the woman that I love." Isabella felt her cheeks flush as every person at the table turned to look at her. After dinner, as everyone was sipping tea and chatting, Max gently guided Isabella out onto the small balcony. The New York City skyline shimmered far in the distance, but from this vantage point, they could not see the glittering skyscrapers. They saw only the humble, familiar rooftops of Brooklyn, the world where Isabella had spent her childhood. "Are you happy?" Max asked, taking her hand in his. "I am happier than I ever believed was possible," she answered, leaning her head against his shoulder. Max then turned her to face him, his gray eyes looking gentle and sincere in a way he reserved only for her. "I am not a perfect man," he said softly. "I have done terrible things in my life, and I may have to do terrible things again to protect my family. But you make me want to be a better man. You brought a light into my world when it was completely dark." Then, he lowered himself onto one knee, and Isabella gasped as he pulled a small red velvet box from his coat pocket. He opened it to reveal an emerald ring, surrounded by a circle of tiny diamonds. It was simple, elegant, and breathtakingly beautiful. "Isabella Reyes," Max said, his voice trembling slightly with emotion. "I know I do not deserve you, but I will spend the rest of my life trying to. Will you marry me? Not right away, but when you feel ready, on your own terms." Isabella's eyes moved from the sparkling ring to the face of the man kneeling before her. She thought about the long, difficult journey that had led her to this exact moment. She had transformed from a woman running from an abusive marriage into someone standing on her mother's balcony, completely loved and cherished. She thought about her parents, together again in the living room, about Sophia and Maggie, and about the unexpected family she had found in the most unlikely of places. "Yes," she finally said, her voice clear through her tears and a brilliant smile. "I will." Max carefully slid the ring onto her finger and then pulled her into his arms. Their kiss was sweet and filled with the promise of a shared future. A wave of applause and joyful cheers erupted from inside the apartment. They had all been watching the entire moment unfold through the glass door. Sophia was the first one out, rushing to embrace them both. Rosa cried tears of happiness in Ricardo's arms, and Maggie discreetly wiped her own eyes with a handkerchief. Later that night, lying safely in Max's arms beneath a sky full of stars, Isabella understood that life really could begin all over again. She was the daughter of a housekeeper, the rebellious young woman who arrived to take her mother's place and ended up freezing a powerful Mafia boss with just one look. But what truly captured his heart was not her external beauty. It was her incredible courage, her profound sincerity, and her spirit that could never be broken. In the darkness of his world, she was the one and only light he ever wanted to hold on to. Their story is proof that genuine love can conquer any obstacle, whether it is social class, a painful past, or the deepest, darkest secrets. This story teaches us many valuable lessons about forgiveness, about courage, about love, and most of all, about hope. It shows us that no matter how deep into the darkness life may push us, there is always a way back to the light, as long as we have the strength to keep moving forward. Dear friends, if this story has touched your heart in any way, please consider subscribing and turning on your notifications. We would also appreciate it if you would like and share this video, and please leave your thoughts in the comments below. We sincerely thank you for watching, and we wish you good health, peace, and happiness in all your days. Goodbye for now, and we will see you in the next video. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful lessons and valuable takeaways for our audience.